Hi, my name is Natasha S. Alford. I'm a journalist and vice president of digital content at thegrio.com. I have always loved storytelling, and as a journalist, I use writing and images to challenge and expand our ideas about people. Many of my stories highlight struggles for justice or celebrate people's achievements in the face of adversity. One very important part of the reporting process is interviewing people. An underreported story I recently wrote about for The Grio, Oprah Magazine, The New York Times, and other publications explored race and identity in Puerto Rico, specifically Afro-Latinx identity. To come up with this idea, I started with my own family and personal story. I'm Afro-Latina, I'm Puerto Rican, and African American. And growing up, I noticed there was often no mention of Afro-Latinx people in the mainstream media, and there was not much racial diversity in the pictures and stories that I saw in the news. In 2010, the census reported that over 75% of people in Puerto Rico identified as white. That number was not reflective of the racial diversity I knew existed on the island. So I wondered, how do people understand race and identity in Puerto Rico, and how does it impact their lives? In addition, all eyes were on Puerto Rico in the summer of 2019 as protesters on the island successfully ousted their governor over text messages that many saw as sexist, homophobic, and classist. As people talked about revolution on the island, I wondered, would that revolution also take on racism? So I decided to investigate all these questions. Today, I'm going to share some of the interview techniques I use to report my story and some tips that you can use to conduct interviews with people in your own community. Once I've decided who to interview, I always like to do basic research about that person. What can I find out about them with a Google search? Have they done any interviews with other journalists? If I'm interviewing someone who isn't in the public eye, I can still research the topic I'll be asking them about. People really appreciate when you reference details during the interview that show you did your homework. Planning the progression of your questions is very important. Make a game plan of what questions you really want this person to answer. Then think, what do you need to ask them first to get them comfortable enough to answer a certain question? Trust is key. And even if you think you have a connection to a community, you may be perceived as an outsider. So don't take it personally. I like to give people a chance to talk about what's important to them first. For example, I might ask, what do you love about your community? What issues do you care about? After that, I start asking more specific questions. You can always be flexible in the moment and ask follow-up questions, but planning your interview in advance will give you more confidence and help the conversation flow. It's also important to ask open-ended questions, which are questions that someone can't answer simply with a yes or no. For example, instead of asking, do you identify as Afro-Latino or Afro-Latinx? Try asking, how would you describe your racial identity? Open-ended questions allow your interview subject to explain who they are and why they feel the way they do in their own words. Their answers might surprise you. One person who surprised me during my reporting was a DJ and African drum player named Junior. He had darker skin than mine, and I identify as Black. But when I asked him, how do you racially identify? He said he didn't call himself Afro-Latino or Black. It was really important to him that he be identified as Puerto Rican. The language he used to describe himself met a different set of criteria than the language I used. He did not fit a stereotype, and he helped give my story a more nuanced perspective. That's why we should also never make assumptions about people we interview. Sometimes it's tempting to rush through your questions, but you will get much better responses if you take your time and set your subject at ease. If someone doesn't answer your question right away, wait a few moments before asking again. Sitting in the silence can actually inspire people to speak more. Also, the first thing a person says to you is not necessarily the truest thing. When I first arrived in Puerto Rico, a lot of people told me race wasn't an issue there. But it turned out that many people were saying that because race is somewhat taboo, something they have been taught not to talk about or they may not feel comfortable discussing. When I took my time, asked more questions, and interviewed more people, I found that Black Puerto Ricans are facing issues like police brutality and discrimination at work and school, and many are fighting against it. Asking questions and getting the conversation to open up will allow you to probe for a deeper truth, but doing this takes time. If you ask open-ended questions and take your time, you will have a lot more material that you can publish. How can you decide which quotes you want to use when editing your interview? Well, if someone gives you a ton of facts or statistics, please summarize that in your own words. That's not the quote that you want. Instead, great quotes capture the emotion and humanity of a story. One of my favorite quotes in the story I wrote about racial identity in Puerto Rico for the New York Times came from an interview I conducted with Kimberly Figueroa Calderon, an activist who was campaigning for more people to identify as Black on the 2020 census. Kimberly told me that the devastating effects of Hurricane Maria on Puerto Rico, which is a U.S. territory, and the U.S. government's slow response to send help revealed to some people just how vulnerable Puerto Rico is to the whims of U.S. imperialism. She said, quote, "We are not the citizens we think we are." I thought this quote was really powerful because it showed that for many people there was a shift in self-perception taking place. These words capture the feeling that drives Kimberly's activism. I chose to report on racial identity in Puerto Rico because of my personal background. Now it's your turn to draw on your identity, to come up with story ideas and interview questions of your own. Ask yourself, what is an issue in my community that's an open secret, something people may know about but deserves further investigation? What issue is being overlooked in a big news story right now? Which people are doing direct work on the issue I'm writing about? Once you have decided who you are going to interview and what you want to talk to them about, remember, start by doing research and planning out the progression of your questions in advance. But of course, stay flexible. Ask open-ended questions that allow your interview subject to describe their own experiences and leave room for their answers to surprise you. Take your time so you can have a more relaxed and open conversation. And listen for quotes that stand out during your interview. Those are the ones you'll want to use in your story and share with others. There are so many underreported stories that need to be told, many in your own backyard. So don't let these stories go underreported. The voices of your community deserve to be heard right now.